We have just heard a very interesting and profound description of the US maximum pressure. And I completely agree, it is quite devastating for the Iranian economy. Our panel, called Iran and the US Toward Negotiations or Escalation. Let me say some words before we start our questions and allow our panelists to express their views. There are some very difficult questions I will pose to them. And before that, I want just to mention where we stand today. Iran has made a series of defined military moves in the Gulf by attacking oil tankers and facilities in Saudi Arabia, as well as downing an American drone. And in the nuclear field, has resumed advancing parts of its program and declared itself free of any commitments in the realm of enrichment. The US has killed, as we all know, Soleimani, a huge and unprecedented event, and Trump was threatening to strike 52 targets in Iran if didn't happen. And they changed the Iranian, actually by doing so, he changed the Iranian basis for future evaluation of American policies. But at the same time, he's continuing to ask the Iranians to resume negotiations, and that continues to be the preferred option for the president. So let me ask our panelists the first question that I want them to relate to, which is the more plausible scenario for the coming year? Is it more the negotiation one or more the escalation one? Let's start with you.
Okay, well, thank you so much for having me. I think we first need to acknowledge how we got here. The Trump administration's Iran policy, if one can call it such, is comparable to a Jackson Pollock painting. US President Donald Trump didn't like his predecessor Barack Obama, and he wanted to make a better deal just so he could stick it to him. Trump threatened to withdraw, but it wasn't until May of 2018, a year after he took office, did he decide that he is going to withdraw, despite the fact that Iran had not violated the JCPOA. This was followed by Secretary of State Mike Pompeo's maximum pressure policy, which includes 12 demands that would change Iran's malign behavior and make it a so-called normal country again. This also included punitive US sanctions on almost all aspects of the Iranian government and the economy, with the exception of oil. Now, during that time, we saw in that first year of the maximum pressure policy, we went from an administration saying that they refused to talk to Tehran unless it changed its behavior, to a US president saying that he would talk with Iran with no preconditions. So the messaging on the part of the administration was confusing, to say the least. But it wasn't until a year later, in May 2019, did the Trump administration decide to impose an oil embargo in the country, what Iran calls economic warfare. And it's there that we see that Iran begins to lash out. And the administration likes to spin it as this is a response, this is Iran's way of acting out of desperation. But this is exactly how US officials describe the Taliban per the Afghanistan papers that recently came out. So just to give you an idea, the Taliban are getting desperate. So it's actually an indicator that we're winning. We're now almost 2 decades into a forever war with no end in sight. Iran is in part lashing out because they view that the administration's real goal is actually regime collapse that would then lead to regime change. And it's really hard to see otherwise when we've seen US officials in this administration on numerous occasions actually say this. We've heard former US Secretary of State Rex Tillerson tell Congress that the long-term goal is regime change. We've heard current Secretary of State Mike Pompeo tells CBS News last year that he hoped that the pressure would make the people rise up and change the regime. We've also heard former National Security Advisor John Bolton and personal lawyer to US President Donald Trump, Rudy Giuliani, speak on the behalf of an Islamic Marxist terror cult based in Albania that advocates for regime change, the MEK, or Mujahideen al-Khaq. So when you see these kind of actions from the administration, it's hard for the Iranians to take them serious. So from their perspective, this is an administration that wants to negotiate. This is an administration out for regime change. We're now 22 months into this so-called maximum pressure policy, and we're not any closer to those 12 demands, 13 if you count human rights that was belatedly added months later. Instead, Iran is withdrawing from much of the JCPOA and now threatening to leave the NPT treaty. I would say, for one, that this maximum pressure policy is a maximum failure. I think we also, in all of this, need to acknowledge the fact that US President Donald Trump does not want a war, and neither does the leadership in Tehran. And what we've seen in the past year has led us down a dangerous path with flashes of escalation that could very well lead us down to a path of war that neither side wants. And with the taking out of Qasem Soleimani just this past month, I think it's worth noting that Tehran has the memory of an elephant, and they still haven't retaliated. So with that in mind, I think that the only way forward at this point is through diplomacy in order to reduce tensions. And unfortunately, we haven't seen anything of that in the past couple months. So the main point here is we're at a point where we're about to hit a possibility of a war. It's right now a 50-50% chance with no way out unless there's diplomacy involved. And so I urge the Europeans especially to kind of take a moment, sorry.
Mike, do you think, what do you think? Is this the scenario that you think the American administration is?
Let me answer that by saying what Donald Trump wants. Donald Trump wanted to get into a negotiation. He campaigned before the American people on a peace and prosperity platform. And when he came into office, there was a debate in the administration about whether to nix the JCPOA or to fix it. He came down on the side of fix, so we had several months of intense negotiations with the Europeans, and then those fell apart. And then he went to nix. But Trump can very easily go back to fix, and there are very significant voices in the administration that are trying to keep fix alive. So I think what Trump thought maximum pressure was going to be leverage over the Iranians to get them back to the negotiating table in order to fix it. But maximum pressure created a dynamic, and the Iranians are under enormous pressure, financially, of course, economically. But we also now, in November, we had the protests all across the country, and we also now have the protests in Iraq and in Lebanon. In Iraq, the protests are young Shiite men going out explicitly against Iran's proxies. In Lebanon, it works indirectly against Iran, but the whole Iranian system is under pressure. And their answer was to try to drive the United States from Iraq. And this pulled Donald Trump into, I think, an arena where he wasn't expecting to be. The Obama administration created a distinction in everyone's mind between the nuclear question and Iran's regional role. And the Trump administration, when it came in, it announced a policy of rollback, of rolling back Iran in the region. But it didn't really devote assets to that. It didn't have a strategy other than the maximum pressure. I mean, the only agent that was actually working on the ground to roll back the Iranians is Israel, America's ally. The United States does not have a ground game. And then for the Iranians, in answer to the maximum pressure, one of the tools that they used was to try to drive the United States from Iraq. That forced Donald Trump to start developing a ground game, which he did with the Qasem Soleimani elimination. And so for Trump, the whole question has become more complex now. I think he sees that there's both the nuclear question and the regional question. And the relations with Iran have gotten quite embittered. he would still like to go to negotiations. He sees himself as a negotiator, but more importantly, he thinks it's part of his brand. He would love to go to the elections, having a major negotiation with the Iranians, not in order to solve the problem, but to be seen to be negotiating. The Iranians as well might also enjoy to have negotiations. The Iranians are masters at getting Americans to pay them to negotiate. Whether it's arms for hostages or whether it's the billions in sanctions relief that Obama delivered during the negotiation, they also recognize that it will negotiations. Americans are very legalistic in the way they think about conflict. We have peace, we have negotiations, we have pressure, and we have war. Those are separate and sequential ways of doing business. The Iranians stick a knife in your side with one hand, and then they reach out and smile with you the others. This is not the way the Americans do it. We do it separate and sequentially. And so the Iranians know this about us, and so they want to get us have us sit down at the table, because when we're sitting down with them at the table, we're not going to be sticking the knife in other places.
Thank you. Ambassador, how does France and Europe, in this case, see the situation?
I think everybody knows how we see the situation. The difficulty is how to continue and what to do. And nobody knows exactly what is going to happen, really. Because breaking the JCPOA, you just can't imagine if Iran is going to be more threatening or less threatening with this maximal pressure, and we just don't know. What we saw for the moment is that Iran did decide to destabilize the region with in the sea, in space, wherever, and regarding the nuclear issue, they step after step are going to get out the JCPOA. So for the moment, what we see, the situation is not better than it was with the JCPOA. But maybe at the end of it, Iran will change its attitude. But what could change, make this attitude change? The sanctions, we'll see if it works or not. Nobody knows. Of course, we can say for the moment it doesn't work, but it is only a year or 18 months. Maybe the sanctions can work after 2-3 years, so that's different. Now, regarding the nuclear issue, we still stick to the idea that the JCPOA is the best framework possible at this stage. Maybe some can think that it is not the right deal, but for the Europeans and France in particular, we want to stick to it, but we see that slowly, step after step, Iran is trying to get out of it. So we did not have any other possibility than putting in place this dispute resolution mechanism, Article 36, and now we are at the very beginning of this. So what is the most probable scenario for the coming year? That we are going to work on the basis of this mechanism. It will take time. It is you have automatic steps and political steps. So we don't know exactly how long it is going to be working, but we are now on the idea that Iran has to come back to the table of the negotiation on the basis of this Article 36 mechanism, I should say. Second thing, so that's the most probable issue about the nuclear deal. Now, the second issue is on the other, on destabilization, I mean, regional influence and ballistic missile. I think that they are going to continue, because I don't know what could make them have another attitude than that. So the pressure will be higher from many countries, and then you have the idea of the domestic elections, including in United States, so that maybe the President of the United States will want to have a new negotiation. And that will be interesting. Shall we go to a global negotiation on the different pillars, I mean nuclear, ballistic, and regional influence, or are we going to go to negotiations on each different thing? And there is a difference between Europeans and the United States about that, but I think it's the next question.
Giora, how does it look from the Israeli point of view?
Okay. Let me ignore for a moment the Israeli side. In the next round of talks, I will speak about Israel. Let me be the spokesman of the Iranian government. It happened to me more than once to try to explain their position. By the way, whenever they speak about the nuclear, the right to have nuclear weapons, one of the Iranian interesting claims is a religious one. They said that all the religions in the world have nuclear weapons. All kinds of Christians have nuclear weapons in France, UK, America, and Russia. The Buddhists have nuclear weapons in China. The Hindus have nuclear weapons in India. The Jews have nuclear weapons. Even the Muslim Sunnis have nuclear weapons in Pakistan. Why the Shias is the only religion that does not have the right to have nuclear weapons? But to be more specific here, the nuclear deal in the Iranian eyes was something like this. We gave something which is X, we got something which is Y, and since we are good businessmen, we believe that Y, what we get, is a little greater than X. That's why we could accept the deal. Now the Americans withdrew unilaterally from the deal, and more than that, they began to impose sanctions on Iran. So the Y that we got is now not 1 Y, it is, let's say, 0.7 Y or 0.6 Y, which is smaller than the X that we give. So it doesn't make sense. So if what we get is smaller than the original deal, then we also have to decrease the X that we give. And the interpretation is that Iran, have to begin to change certain things and to enrich uranium more than what we are committed to in order to make the X equal to the 0.7, which is today. Now, what is the Iranian real plan? I believe that they are trying not to push too hard, not to push the Europeans to make a similar move like the Americans and to withdraw from the deal, because they still need the legitimacy and the economic benefits that they get from the European countries. And they will try to wait until November, hopefully that there will be another American president that will be able to return everything to the original plan. And if it does not work, then I believe that some creative mediator is needed in order to come with the following idea. Let's make some amendments in the original deal, but these amendments will be described in quite a vague way. So Iran might say, okay, these are so minor amendments, we can accept it, and as expression of goodwill, we are ready to return. But Donald Trump will be able to say that this is not minor changes, this is a dramatic and crucial changes that change everything, make it very, very different than the terrible deal that Obama made a few years earlier. And then everybody might be happy. But in order to reach such a point, and it happens very often in politics, you need to have, let's say, some creative mediator that can get the confidence of both sides. It is probably not going to happen before November, but it might be needed after November. But we have to remember that until something like this happens, the situation today is far from being good, because if the whole idea was to prevent Iran from being close to nuclear weapon, then what is happening right now is exactly the opposite, because Iran says, okay, we are not committed to our commitments or to our obligations. That's why we can proceed and do certain things that are actually create the threat of nuclear weapons much more imminent, much more clear, than what could have been. So far, I would say the American policy as today is far from being successful.
Thank you, Giora. Every one of you has mentioned, and correctly so, because Trump is also mentioning it every time. It was also after the assassination of Soleimani that he has mentioned negotiations. And actually, it looks as if at the end of the day, nobody knows if it will happen before, during this year, or after elections in the US, but in order to solve this crisis, one needs negotiations. Now, let me ask you, please, what do you think is the preferable option? Is it just a nuclear agreement? Because a nuclear agreement is also a difficult one. We saw how difficult it was to reach it in the previous time. Would it be only a nuclear agreement, what we in Israel call a narrow agreement, or would it be a wider one, including the missile program, including the regional aspects, Syria, Iraq, and others? How do you see it? How do you see it plausible, and what do you think is better to have? So let's start with the one who has to represent Iran.
I'm not here to represent Iran. I'm here to represent my views, and if you feel that way, I'm sorry that you don't believe in having balance here. So the reality is that US President Donald Trump does not care about the details. He hasn't even read the 150-page paper. What he really wants is a photo op like he did with North Korea and an opportunity to sign a paper and say that he did something to make good on his promises to his supporters. And that's exactly what Mike was essentially alluding to, that this is more about an opportunity to say he did something even though he hasn't. I think it's worth noting that the Iranians have also said they're open to negotiations, that they would come back to the negotiating table, but they want these sanctions removed. In the wake of the assassination of Quds Force Commander Qasem Soleimani, it's become known now that the Iranians are definitely not going to be sitting down with this administration, at least for the near future. The confidence building measure that was founded with the signatories of the JCPOA that included the United States is all gone now. And it's going to take some months, if not years, for any possibility of bilateral negotiations. What we're really going to be seeing here is a multilateral negotiations that are going to be taking place, because the reality is, why would Iran want to negotiate bilaterally? This is an administration that has the credibility gap the size of the Atlantic Ocean, and it's an administration that's been advocating for their collapse. So for them, this is not somebody to trust. So what this really boils down to is that they're going to have to sit down multilaterally, and this is not going to look very different from the current JCPOA.
Thank you, Oli. Ambassador, do you think, since what was presented here is and what the Iranians are saying is that they don't want to talk bilaterally, in any case, even if sanctions are removed, they want to have, again, the P5+1. And actually, I have to admit that the French president was the only one that made a major effort to bring both sides, the Iranians and the Americans, to the table. He has brought also a kind of a understanding between the two sides, but at the end of the day, Rouhani didn't pick up the telephone, and there was no conversation between Trump and Rouhani. How do you think is it possible to have, again, the P5+1 or something like that? And what kind of an agreement can come out of that?
Yes, it's difficult. As you all know, yes, the French president tried to make it best to have this meeting and then this phone call. It was in New York last September. Now, is it still possible? We hope so, but we are not sure at all. The parameters have changed because Iran made steps slowly going out of the commitments of the JCPOA, so it's more difficult today, and made actions, once again, of destabilization of the region. So the parameters, the situation has changed. We're still ready to try, but it becomes more and more difficult to go that way. At the end of it, I think that the most difficult question is, must we have 3 different negotiations, nuclear, ballistic missiles, and regional influence, or only one, a kind of global deal. I must say that in terms of negotiations, I don't imagine that a global deal is possible today. Now, building on the different, different issues, I don't say that it's more easy. It's easier, but at least it's feasible in my I should say, almost personal opinion. And you must see something which is important. The nuclear deal, you had a mechanism of verification and the international agency to monitor the deal. With the missiles and the regional influence, you don't have any mechanism of that kind. That means that you must invent something, imagine something to just about the compliance, about the fact that the global deal is respected. And that kind of verification mechanism will be extremely difficult to negotiate and to implement, of course. So it seems to me that it's better, and we stick to this approach for the moment, to come from the agreement of the GCPOA and then try to put in place other negotiations than having a very big deal, which could probably only be possible if the maximal pressure has worked, and at the end of it, Iran became extremely weak, and with no other possibility than negotiate that kind of big deal, etc., etc. But the resilience of this country is absolutely extraordinary, and the fact that China and Russia are not on the same position regarding a total embargo, maximal pressure, etc., gives some room, some air to Iran. You can't it's not an island. You see, so it's to have the results. I mean, Iran, weak enough, sufficiently weak to be obliged in a way to go to the table of negotiation. I personally don't believe in this. This country knows how to suffer, so it will be difficult.
Let me ask Giora, the Israeli position, and then, Mike, you will please tell us, is it possible with Trump to have what people have said here on the panel? Please.
Usually, the right policy, especially of powers or superpowers, should consist of three efforts. One is political, the second is military, and the third is economic one. I think that one of the Trump's mistakes is that he focused on the economic pressure on Iran. He almost gave up the option to use military force despite the assassination or the killing of Soleimani. And as far as political efforts is concerned, he actually ignored the Europeans, ignored other potential partners. And by doing or using or choosing this kind of strategy, he misses some of the real, let's say, more effective efforts. However, even if we take this American policy to focus on economic pressure as the main tool, I think that the Americans are missing the best possible opportunity to cause real damage to Iran. Because the Americans are trying to push Iran directly and to impose sanctions on Iran. But Iran is a very proud nation, a very strong one. They can suffer a lot of misery of their own people, but they are not going to give up so easily. Now, if we try to look at the Middle East and see where Iran is more successful than anywhere else, then this is not in Iraq, not in Syria, not in Yemen, but in Lebanon. Because the state of Lebanon is actually occupied by Iran, because Hezbollah is controlling Lebanon, and Iran is controlling Hezbollah, so Iran is in full control of Lebanon. Now, today there is a good opportunity to do something with this, because Lebanon is in a real economic crisis. The ratio between debt and the GDP is about 160%, which might bring the state of Lebanon to be in a default, to be actually economically collapsed. And only recently, a new government was established in Lebanon. Now, what are the first moves that this government is doing? As it was predicted, They are approaching all big countries, all big banks, financial institutions in the world, and they ask for long-term loans in order to help them to recover the economy. Now, this is exactly the time that the answer that all those European and American institutions should tell the Lebanese government, which is again controlled by Hezbollah, is the following message. We are ready to give you the loan based on some, let's say, comfortable economic conditions. However, in order to get those loans, you, the government of Lebanon, that again, Hezbollah is part of this government, should be committed to at least two very, let's say, modest moves. Number one, to make a commitment and to sign that there will be no production of accurate missiles on the land of Lebanon. And number two, whatever you already have, Hezbollah, it's yours. But you are committed not to continue and import sophisticated weapons from Syria, Iran, and others. Now, contrary to what some cynical people might say, if the Lebanese people understand that the only way to recover their economy and to save them from terrible economic crisis is that Hezbollah will agree to these two conditions, Iran will have to comply with, Hezbollah will have to comply with it, because Hezbollah, we call it terrorist organization. This is a mistake. Iran is a political movement, depends mostly on the internal legitimacy of the people in Lebanon, and this is the right way to push the Iranian, not wherever or whenever it is difficult, which is directly against Iran, but to do it in an area which is much more comfortable, and this is Lebanon, which is actually controlled by them. And this is the right way to begin to minimize the abilities of Hezbollah to be what Hezbollah is.
What Giora is now mentioning is exactly the Israeli interest, because if you look on most of the issues, no question that Hezbollah and Lebanon, as we saw also yesterday within the war play that was here, that Hezbollah is the most profound army equipped with the best missiles and everything. But the question is, and that is a question that you will have to handle all the others representing Trump on this stage, is Trump interested in any way in those issues? At the end of the day, it's our problem. He doesn't care about Hezbollah so much, even though he's putting sanctions.
Just one sentence. I think that, again, besides the Israeli direct interests in Lebanon, which are not necessarily American interests, if Trump wants to push Iran and to cause Iran to begin paying prices, then it is a direct effort against the most successful achievements of Iran in the past 20 years. Mm-hmm. And this is an American interest, and the cost is that minimal. I mean, it doesn't have to take any real efforts in order to cause the government of Lebanon to be in panic, because without an American economic support, the state of Lebanon will be destroyed economically. So it is very easy to achieve.
Please, Mike.
I totally agree with Giora. I think it's a great idea. I disagree with the specific conditions, but that's a detail. We can argue about that. But the idea of conditioning the support for Lebanon in that way is a good one. And now is the time to make these arguments. As I mentioned before, the Obama administration created this distinction between the Iranian nuclear power and Iranian power in the region. And the Trump administration unconsciously accepted the distinction and wasn't thinking of the challenge of Iran in a holistic way like this. I think that the rise of the protests in Iraq and Lebanon has impressed itself somewhat on the administration, but I think the real creative thought about how to use this to our advantage has not taken place. But they're receptive to the message now for sure. I also think that Iraq Iraq offers enormous opportunities, and I think that the pressure on Iran in Iraq is greater because the protesters are explicitly going out against Iran. It's a neighboring country. Their aspiration is to dominate the Persian Gulf, and they're Shiite young men that are making this argument, so it hits at their legitimacy. To your original question about whether it will be a narrow nuclear negotiation or a holistic one, if it actually goes to negotiations, and I also agree with Giora that the chance of a real negotiation happening between now and the election is nil. I think we may get a fake, there's a chance of a fake negotiation because both sides could possibly see, as I mentioned, advantage to being seen to negotiate. But an actual real negotiation designed to achieve results is only going to happen after the election. And it will definitely become a negotiation about the nuclear question separate from the others, because you'd have to divide it up into, in practical terms, you have to divide it up. And the Iranians know that they got a big benefit from Obama dividing the two things, and they want to keep that division. And they'll do it. They won't do it in terms of notion. They'll say we'll have two different tracks, and then the one track that will move will be the nuclear one, and the other one won't. And at a certain point, they would put the United States in a position of having to decide: do we take the deal that we have on the nukes and forget about the other track, or do we insist on agreement on everything? And if it ever came to the point where we actually had an agreement, I'm not sure that can even happen. But if it did happen, Trump would take the deal. Now, the Iranians are very good. They get very good at getting Americans to pay them to negotiate, but they're also very good at getting what I would call deposits. You remember, I used the notion of the Rabin negotiation with the Syrians. The Syrians and the Iranians, they're very good at getting us to pay them for anything, for any kind of engagement. And one of the ways they get paid is through the deposit. So when the Syrians were negotiating with the Rabin about the Golan, they insisted that up front there must be, in principle, you must accept the principle that you're going to withdraw back to the 4 June 67 line, right? So once you agree in principle, you have given it away. And then once it was supposedly given just temporarily to Hafez al-Assad, but then lo and behold, when you sit across the negotiating table with Bashar al-Assad, he starts with, I want the deposit. And so the minute you agree notionally, you've lost it. The Iranians did the same thing to Obama. When he sat down to negotiate with him on the nuclear thing, first they said, pay me money to negotiate. Then they said, in principle, I want to understand that all restrictions on our enrichment and reprocessing will be lifted at the end. And then it just became a negotiation about how long will the restrictions be and what will the restrictions be. They'll do the same thing. They might do it even before, if there are negotiations over nothing between now and the election, they'll seek a deposit. And the deposit will be that we're going to have a track on Yemen, a track on Syria, a track on Lebanon. That's huge for them. If we treat them as a power of equal status, they get a say in what happens in Yemen, right? We've given them a lot, and they're very clever at this. They'll think of all kinds of ways to simply organize the negotiation so that we actually end up conceding things to them that they don't deserve, because we're a great power. And they're not a great power. And Donald Trump, that's the one thing that Donald Trump has understood that neither of his predecessors, that his immediate predecessors understood. We are a hell of a lot more powerful than them. And we have a whole range of options of how to deal with them. And we don't have to play their game on their terms. Just because they use some little militia that they put together yesterday to attack our troops doesn't mean that we have to blame that militia and hold it responsible. We can kill Qasem Soleimani and nothing will happen. And I think Donald Trump will continue to understand this, but there are a lot of people in the American government who don't.
Very interesting. You have put it in the way that I think that Trump is thinking. What can the Iranians do in order to change the equation and be in a better position when they start negotiations? Because if there is one thing that the Iranians don't want to get into negotiations where they are so weak, and the leader is saying it every second day, we are not in a position to start negotiation. What can they do in order to improve their cards before they come to the table?
Well, I think I should just follow up on what Michael was saying. Basically, he summarized what I had said earlier, that US President Donald Trump basically wants to turn the old JCPOA and make it his own, where it's President Donald J. Trump's JCPOA in big, bold gold letters. So essentially, we're going to end up with the same nuclear deal from my understanding just now. And that seems like we've put all this trouble and effort with this maximum pressure policy. And we've seen all this escalation in the recent months. And now we're in a situation that we very well might end up in a war because of nothing. Because in the end, we're apparently wanting the same exact deal with a different signature on it. But going back to your question, it seemed that for a little while, up until the death of Qasem Soleimani, the Iranians felt like they had the upper hand. But when they retaliated by striking Iraqi bases that housed US troops earlier this month, that was their way of putting the ball back in the administration's court, and as they claimed, it was de-escalation. Now, we can interpret that as whatever you like. But right now, for the time being, we haven't seen any other escalatory actions. Having that been said, the Iranians aren't going to stay quiet. They're going to continue to lash out and make their voices heard as long as these sanctions are in place, specifically the oil embargo. And that's the unfortunate truth. And it's this tit-for-tat mentality between the United States and Iran right now that's so dangerous, because I would assume that the killing of US soldiers would be the red line. And if that were to happen, that's when we end up in this war. So I think the Iranians are going to want to negotiate from a position of power. They're not willing to negotiate. We have to remember that when the JCPOA was accepted by the Iranians, the Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei came out and said, this is heroic flexibility. Here's me saying I'm open to negotiation. He likes playing good cop and bad cop. He's said some mixed messaging over the past couple years, but he's never technically closed the door in diplomacy. He does say he doesn't want to talk to the US and does not trust the United States, but he's never said, well, I'm not going to negotiate with the remaining signatories. So the Iranians, I think, as some of our panelists have said, are going to rely on the election. They're going to wait until November to see what happens and see what the outcome is. But if nothing changes, then this is a stalemate as is. They very well might change their tactics, but for the time being, it seems this is the direction that we'll be moving forward, because it's becoming clear that the ideas of this maximum pressure policy, that these 12 demands are not going to be met, and that Iran isn't going to change its behavior. And so this seems to be the direction we're going.
Thank you, Holly. Ambassador, is there any new option that the French president can come out with a suggestion or something? Because if not, it looks as if the Europeans went into a path that will bring them at the end to the Security Council. If that happens, the Iranians are saying openly what they didn't say in the past, that they will leave the NPT. What happens then? Quite an easy question.
No, but we are not there yet. I don't know if there are many options, many different options. I mean, in the diplomatic world. You know, we now have two key problems. First one is the fact that international community is divided about the right strategy towards Iran, including in the P5+1. We are not on the same line. So the first issue is at least to have a common attitude regarding Iran, at least in the diplomatic field, because if not, nothing is going to happen about diplomacy. The second is the credibility, I should say, of our signature, because Iran signed the nuclear deal, and then the United States got out. So now the Iranians say, why should we go back to the table of negotiation? Because even if we have a result, there is a problem of credibility of the signature of our partner. And you, France, yeah, we know that you are making efforts, but you are on the same side than the United States, the Brits, etc., etc. So, come on. Now you must reassure that even if we go to the table of negotiation, your signature, globally, roughly speaking, will be respected by yourself at the end of it. So this is a problem of credibility. Why should they come back to a table of negotiation? After 16 years, we had the result, and then we quit. Not France, but the system. Okay, it's over. So that's the second difficulty. Now, about the various possibilities. No, for the moment, I think that there are no options. We are in a very difficult and very threatening moment of time. We could. Everybody is thinking about possible wars and things like that. We must stick to the objective. Iran must not have the bomb, and I think will not have the bomb. Nobody will permit that. Now, how to go that without having war? That is the key question.
Now we have 3 minutes, and please, 1 minute, Giora, please. What happens? It looks as if nobody is assuming that negotiations in the current year will happen, but Iran might decide to do some extreme steps. What will be about Israel? Are we standing alone? And then, Mike, you will continue.
A few months ago, after the Iranian attack on the Saudi's oil facilities, there was a growing concern in Israel that Iran is ready or might take a proactive actions against Israel or actually begin some kind of a war against Israel in the near future. And I think that this is not a reasonable scenario. And I would say the following: Iran might decide to initiate a comprehensive war or well-coordinated attacks against Israel only if they manage to achieve at least one of their 3 very explicit goals. Either they have a nuclear weapon, or they manage to succeed to build in Syria similar capacity like the one that they had in or in Lebanon, like Hezbollah, or if Hezbollah, this is the 3rd goal, Hezbollah have a critical mass of precise missiles. And unless they achieve at least one of these 3 goals, almost regardless of what is happening between Iran and the United States or what is happening in Iraq, in other places, Iran is probably not going to initiate anything against Israel.
Mike, please.
Yeah, I don't see any, by the way, I disagree, I think, with everyone here who said that maximum pressure isn't working. I think they're hurting very badly, and I think that maximum pressure has done a lot for the United States with regard, and for Israel with regard to Iran. Maximum pressure has played a significant role in bringing out the protests in Iraq and Lebanon. Obviously, they have their local causes, but it's certainly contributed. I think it's contributed to the protests in Iran. And Iran now, the game that Iran played at the beginning of this, if they're answering maximum pressure with maximum resistance, the game they played at the beginning was, interdicting shipping in the Persian Gulf and then pretending it's not them. And a shockingly large number of people in the United States pretended it wasn't Iran. And I'm talking about most of the Democratic Party. If you just look at the news, do we really know if the Houthis are, so that game is over. It's completely over, and I think they're really feeling it. So what I would expect them to do is not to do a kind of grand thing, but to go back to try to hide their hand again. Also, when they surround, they really got brazen when they besieged the embassy in Iraq. People were spray painting on the walls of the embassy. We answer to Hajj Qasim and so on. It was openly their open affiliation to Iran was being expressed and celebrated, and that's a problem for them now because everyone recognizes that it's Iran and everyone regards a retaliation against Iran as legitimate. Now, within constraints, the Qasem Soleimani thing was kind of I don't want to say it was unique, but it was a moment that Trump exploited deftly because there was an understanding for most Americans that he was targeting Americans directly. And that, so it was understood in American politics as self-defense. I don't think they're going to make that mistake so crudely again. And they're going to try to put themselves in a position where, where Trump can't make the self-defense argument. And he's under pressure. They understand that he's under pressure from the right, from the, let's call it the isolationist right. The Rand Paul, Tucker Carlson, that's a strong current of opinion. It's not just in the media, that's a strong current of opinion on the right in the United States that what the hell are we doing in these places? We don't have any business there, we're just making it worse. Trump is very much aware of that, and the Iranians are aware that he's aware of that. So they'll try to see if they can exploit that. But I think that they have lost a lot in this game.
Thank you very much. Our time is over. Actually, we took 1 minute from the next panel. I'm sure the problem is not going to be solved. So next time, we'll deal with the issue again. Thank you so much.